Hi, I'm Carmen Tyler with the Imprimatur Group, and I'm standing here with John Lakowski, and he is the founder of the Institute of World Politics, and we're going to talk to him a little bit. First off, tell me about the history of this fabulous building.
This building was built in 1908 by Charles Marlatt, who was the chief entomologist of the agriculture department, who married a very prosperous lady. But I like to say that if you want to live in a 12,000-foot mansion like this, 8 blocks north of the White House, you just need to become an entomologist. Anyway, it was a private mansion until 1969. What's noteworthy about it is that he was an artist, and he designed all of these different insects, which he sent to the wood carvers, and there are carvings in the wood paneling in our major public rooms of butterflies and beetles and dragonflies and all sorts of wonderful things. In the 1970s, the building was the trade mission of the Soviet embassy, and it was also a KGB station.
Oh, wow.
And so we have here, one of our master's degrees is in strategic intelligence. It's the first intelligence degree outside of the U.S. government. And one of our courses is in counterintelligence. And in that course, we had a guest lecturer once who was a KGB defector who announced to the class, "I used to have office upstairs."
Oh, my goodness. That's fascinating. Oh, now it houses the Institute of World Politics, yes. So tell me, why did you found the Institute of World Politics?
I served on a congressional staff in the State Department and the National Security Council. I had the Soviet portfolio for 4 years under Ronald Reagan in the White House. And I found that there were many people doing jobs in government for which I thought they were inadequately professionally prepared. And I included myself in that number on certain things, in spite of having had a very substantial education in international affairs. And so I found that nobody except senior military officers studied military strategy. I happen to think that diplomats and policymakers who make the decision to send our troops into harm's way should know something about military strategy and should be able to integrate the diplomatic art with the military art. I found that most intelligence officers, maybe 95%, had never studied intelligence. There's a lot to study. There's the history of it. There are the policy issues. There are the epistemological issues. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge. How do you know something is true? How do you know that your own cultural biases or foreign disinformation or strategic deception are not coloring your views of reality? And there are many other impediments to seeing foreign reality correctly. None of the major schools of international affairs were studying things like propaganda, disinformation, strategic deception, and so on. Then nobody was studying counterintelligence. We're the only institution that was paying attention, for example, to some of the activities of that are not just espionage, but the foreign influence activities, the interference with our elections, for example, the Russian and Chinese interference in our in the social political life of our country. We have been studying this. We teach it. We've been filling these gaps. There are many other gaps. The whole field of public diplomacy, which is relations with people and not just with governments. And that includes such fields as exchanges, visitors programs, information programs, international broadcasting by the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, that sort of thing. There is the whole field of strategic influence, political action, political warfare, ideological warfare. These are things that happen in the world. Nobody was teaching these things.
Well, remind our viewers the different studies that they can do here, the graduate programs. programs?
Well, we have 5 master's degree programs. One is called Statecraft and International Affairs. Another is called Statecraft and National Security. We have our third 2-year program is called Strategic Intelligence Studies. And then we have an 18-month program that was designed principally to accommodate the needs of the armed forces. The Army, for example, has sent its colonels and lieutenant colonels here to study in lieu of going to war college. We have a 1-year executive master's program. We have 18 graduate certificate programs, and we have the nation's first doctoral program in national security. It's a professional doctorate.
All right. Well, and let's talk about funding for the Institute of World Politics. How do you go about doing that?
Well, tuition pays about half our bills, okay. And then we need to raise the rest from private donations. There are very few foundations in this country. There are something like 30,000 plus foundations with a corpus of over $1 million. And there are probably less than a dozen of those foundations that support foreign policy and national security in a generic sense. There is a widespread assumption that the U.S. government takes care of all these matters, but, it doesn't. And it is important that there be private institutions to avoid the kind of groupthink that can happen within the government's own very worthy educational institutions. There's the Foreign Service Institute at the Department of State. Excellent. The problem is that if everybody goes there in the State Department and there's no variegation from different points of view, then you can start getting a conventional wisdom that may not necessarily be optimal. The Army, for example, is I believe the most enlightened of the U.S. government institutions on this score, because it does not want to create groupthink. It doesn't want to get stuck in going to war, for example, with the wrong doctrine. And it needs it actively wants to have intellectual toughening of its leadership, who can think out of the box sometimes.
Now, if someone wanted to support the Institute, what would they need to do?
Well, we have our website, which is IWP, Institute of World Politics, iwp.edu for education. And we have a donation page there, and you can always call me up, or and I'd love to. My business. So much of my business is meeting and trying to inspire potential supporters for the school.
Well, hopefully we can get more people interested and to get you some more funding. So I want to thank John Lakowski, and we're going to be right back with another guest from the World Institute of Politics. All right, I'm standing here with Bhaskar Sunkara. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. And tell me a little bit about the Jacobin magazine.
Well, Jacobin is the largest democratic socialist publication in the English language. We have around 50,000 subscribers, and we reach close to 2 million people every month.
Fantastic. Now, I know some people don't understand the difference between democratic socialism and social democracy. So can you give us a little bit on the definition of that and the reason of your choosing?
Well, we have a common ancestor, social democracy and democratic socialists. The way the term has evolved came to mean that social democrats want radical transformations but stop at the question of private ownership of the means of production, to use the arcane thing, where democratic socialists generally want to go beyond that. I mean, in a different context, might call myself a left social democrat and so on. So the terms are interchangeable, but the key thing is a common commitment to forms of social reform. Mm-hmm. And I think that to make those reforms sustainable and to deepen them, we need to turn over production to worker-owned firms, not necessarily state ownership, right, but independent worker-owned firms. Most social democrats think that that's an idea that has, came and went.
Got it. Are there any candidates on the Democratic side that you feel closely aligned with you or not?
Well, I think that on the actual ideology of democratic socialism, there's no real candidates in this field. It's a question that's not particularly relevant. So the question of Medicare for all, for instance, is an important one. But if we don't have the power to win something like Medicare for all, which is established as right in most countries around the world, it's kind of ridiculous to be talking about worker ownership of the means of production, these other more abstract questions. Of course, I support Bernie Sanders as a candidate who does advocate certain expansions of the welfare state, which I think will benefit ordinary people. But the vast majority of his supporters aren't socialist and don't think about that word, and it's not really relevant to their lives.
Got it. And to the average person, sometimes the idea of socialism just frightens them. So how do you go about talking to the average American who doesn't always have time to do the research and the history behind everything?
Well, I think that to be honest, most people don't think one way or another about socialism because it's not particularly relevant to their lives. And if someone, when it comes to mind, they think of the Soviet Union, I would think, yes, that's a terrible example of a government. In the same way, if you advocate a form of capitalism and someone thinks about Pinochet and what happened in the 1970s in Chile, you'd be like, yes, that was terrible, but I'm advocating something different. Often, a lot of Americans think about Nordic countries, and I say, yes, there was a lot of positive reforms there, but I want to go a little bit deeper. But often it's about taking issues from a less abstract plane than just talking about, asking questions about what people are actually experiencing day to day. And in America, there's a huge layer of the population that's been neglected by elites in the Democratic Party, been neglected by university professors and talking heads and whatnot, and cast aside. And a lot of them are drawn rightly to a candidate in Trump that at least speaks in a little bit to what they're experiencing. I think has the wrong solutions. He's going to end up immiserating more people in many, many different ways. But I think that those are the people that we need to be reaching out to as well, not just liberals or others.
All right, one other question. How close is America to having a good balance between socialism and capitalism?
Well, I think that there's an immediate set of reforms that are broadly popular. I think if we win Medicare for all, if we expand a jobs program so everyone who wants to work can contribute to society, I think that's a huge start. And that'll mean a better world. It'll mean more infants surviving their infancy. It'll mean more people living into older age. It'll mean people actually being able to retire with dignity at 65 after a life of hard work, being able to enjoy retirement. And I think that's what most people want. Now, if they want something beyond that, then I'll be there to advocate something beyond that. But I think that really that's what Americans are fighting for today.
All right, thank you very much for talking with us. And yes. Okay, we have questions from students.
How you doing, sir? I'm Marshall Wilson.
How are you?
Pleasure to meet you. So I just wanted to ask you, you insisted earlier, and I agree with you, you insisted that, should I take that?
You can if you want.
Okay,
Yes, go
thanks.
ahead. There we go.
You insisted earlier that that citizens should hold their governments accountable no matter what form of government they have. Absolutely agree 100%. The question is, once I've surrendered my natural right to private property, how do I then manage to hold my government accountable? Thank you, sir.
Well, I think that you have your civic rights and you have rights rooted in other forms. So one way to think about it is this. The average person, of course, we should separate personal property and private property. Your home, your car, your toothbrush, these are forms of personal property. Private property, your right as a business owner, for example. Well, if that's an important right to expressing your political views, then how come that right is limited to merely 5-6% of the population? So instead, what I'm proposing is expanding that right of ownership from 5-6% of the population to 60-70% of the population, people who work day to day. Of course, we'll still have to elect a management. Of course, if you don't show up to work, you'll still have to get fired. Of course, inefficient firms will still have to fail so we can compete and innovate. But I'm for expanding that right, not diminishing the right.
May I? Okay, so the thing is, though, that I don't recognize the difference between personal property and private property. I believe that private property is whatever I earn. It's an extension of my ownership of myself, so that I use my time, my talents, my capabilities, my effort to create new wealth. That wealth belongs to me as an extension of myself, and any any abrogation of that right is an abrogation of my right of self-ownership, which is the most fundamental right there is. I am me, I own myself. And at the moment that anyone tries to take away anything that I own because I created it or I earned it, they've stolen from me and they've abrogated that right. So I don't recognize a difference between personal property and private property. Thank you, sir.
Well, yeah, I think the key is wealth is socially created. And often when we think about the small capitalist, the person working with 3, 4 other people who puts in their own labor, of course, they have a certain amount of right to that property. But when we're talking about massive, large corporations, these are corporations where ordinary people at every level actually do all the planning, implementation, design, from low management to middle management, and so on. And I think that we could have a system which those people have equity in those companies. And that equity means that they'll be more incentivized to produce and innovate. And there'll always be room for entrepreneurs in this sort of society. But I think that the permanence of ownership just by virtue of planting your flag first in a company doesn't entitle someone to that amount of power over other people.
Okay, I would disagree about the foundation of that, but I appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you. And go ahead and state your name. For the
Marshall Wilson. I'm a student here at IWP.
Okay, great. Thank you.
ma'am.
And I believe we also have another student too, and we're going to have you come on and go ahead and state your name and step down, right down here. There you go. There you
Thank
go.
you. Hi, Sebastian Smirano. I'm a graduate student here. Sankara, thanks for showing up. We appreciate it. I was born and raised in Eastern Europe under Ceausescu, so I'm a little confused and would like to know how you would reconcile the idea of basically coercing people into working a certain amount of hours or limiting the number of hours with kind of the voluntary decision to work however many hours I can. If we're trying to go more towards a cooperation, or are we trying to go more sort of like a collective coercion type of dynamic?
Well, when I was 13 years old, I really wanted a job because I was the youngest of 5, and all my siblings were older. They were working. They had disposable income. My parents were immigrants. We didn't have much money. I could not work. Now, that was obviously something I wanted to do, but it was a government legislation prevented child labor and prevented me from working until I turned 15. In the same way, I might want to work 11, 12, 13 hours. If you do want to do that, you're free to get a second job. But the idea of legislation limiting, for example, the amount of hours someone could work at a workplace is to say you should be able to earn a decent living with 35, 40 hours. And in fact, that's a human right to earn a decent living for full-time work. And that allows our other time for family, for sports, for God, for whatever you want in your spare time. And we use collective action through unions, and we use collective action through legislation to allow ourselves that bargain and that extra free time. But of course, that is a form of coercion, but that's far different than the coercion of the Eastern Bloc, which is limiting what people thought, what they expressed, and whatnot. And that's the type of coercion that is unacceptable and should be overturned and was rightfully overturned by the agency of ordinary people throughout the Eastern Bloc in Romania and elsewhere.
Great. Do I have time for a follow-up? Or?
Yes.
Yeah. So it feels to me that if you're looking for a temporary, for a long-term conclusion or solution to this, so wouldn't it be that anything that kind of goes instinctually against human nature, which is to kind of have a consistent rule upon them, is going to at some point create again the same cycle of resistance, but just from the other side? So it doesn't seem to be a long-term solution. It seems to always be a temporary cycle of actually creating a class struggle in itself.
Well, I mean, if I'm understanding well, first of all, in my view, human nature doesn't amount to much. I think human beings, at the very least, know when we're being exploited, know when we're being oppressed. And if we have resources to protect ourselves and our family, we'll pursue those resources. I think that is instinctual. And beyond that, I do think there's always going to be discontent, and there's always going to be politics. And in a social society, I imagine there will be anti-establishment feeling. Just like in our society, there's often anti-establishment feeling. We saw just a big wave of anti-establishment feeling, which I hugely disagreed with the election of Donald Trump. But we still see the institutions of our republic intact. And I think in the same way in a social society, you're going to still have the permanence of politics and dissent, and that's a good thing. That's what it means to be human. And if we ever try to eliminate that instability, then we're truly on the road to serfdom.
Great, appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those questions, answering those questions. Go ahead. Now we have Eric Blanc. Thank you for being here. How did you think the debate went?
I thought the debate went well. We made our case strongly and I think pretty convincingly.
Well, I want to talk to you a little bit about your book, Red State Revolt. Tell me a little bit about that and your advocacy for teachers' unions.
Yeah, I mean, the United States right now is in the midst of the first strike wave in decades, and I think it's really significant because history has shown and recent experience has shown that the way that working people get better living conditions and get more rights at work is not by just pleading with politicians or hoping that management does the right thing, but by withholding their labor and fighting back. And so that's what we've seen all across these red states, that teachers have struck and won and made huge gains, not just for themselves, but for their students.
Let's talk a little bit about what happened in Santa Clarita yesterday. We had another shooting at a school. So talk a little bit about things like that under what can be helped where that doesn't happen, where workers' unions, will that help that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's a few different things going on there. One is that the epidemic of mass shootings we've seen in the United States are in large part due both to the influence of the NRA over the political process and big business, and then also just the really deterioration of mental health services in our country due to the inefficiencies of a private health industry. And so if we're going to talk about preventing these types of tragedies, it's really going to require both rolling back the power of the NRA and bringing something like Medicare for All to the United States so that people who really need mental health treatment can get that before something like this happens.
Do you think teachers need to be taught how to handle situations like that more?
I think that actually there's quite a lot of treatment right now for if you're a teacher talking about how to deal with mass shootings. And so the crucial question is how do we prevent these from arising in the first place?
Got it. All right, so you are a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, and I've been talking a little bit about the differences between what a democratic socialism is and what social democracy is. Could you tell me your definition and where you lean?
Yeah, I think that there's a good amount of overlap between social democracy and democratic socialism. Social democracy, as we've seen it been practiced, means that really basic human needs like the right to health care, education, sometimes housing are provided publicly and aren't dependent on the market or private industry. So these are gains that were won by workers and socialists against capitalists and against the capitalist system. But nevertheless, social democracy existed within the confines still of the private ownership of big business. So what that meant was that the gains that they made were unstable. And as we've seen over the last decades, a lot of the gains that were won in social democratic countries were rolled back. So what democratic socialism would mean would be to build off of those gains that were made as far as decommodifying huge parts of the economy, building off of democratic institutions and rights. You know, we're in favor of universal suffrage, we're in favor of basic political liberties, but moving beyond the dictatorship of capital over the vast majority of the resources and the economic life of our country. So what democratic socialism means is sort of expanding on the logic of social democracy to put the basically economic sphere under the public and democratic control of the majority.
So do you see socialism and capitalism as a checks and balances kind of thing? Like how do you see America in the future, your idealistic America?
I think that the first step, we're not near a socialist transformation in the United States right now. I think the first step that we need to see would be something like passing Medicare for All, getting rid of the private insurance companies across the United States. If we're able to show that, in fact, we'd be able to provide better and cheaper health care through public as opposed to private provisioning, it's that type of logic that will really expand into other spheres too. Because like if we can do that for healthcare, why shouldn't we do that for how we deal with energy production? Why shouldn't we do that for transport? So the logic, education in some ways we already have. And so I think that in fact people look at education and see, well, this is something that is seen as a right. I think that's the basic goal that we have for more and more spheres of society. The way that people look at public education now, where anybody, still the assumption is that if you are in the United States and you're a child, you're going to have at least through high school education provided for you. But we believe that that should be the case for housing. We believe that should be the case for education. Other countries have done that. So I think that that's both the short term and the strategic orientation, because insofar as you're able to give people confidence that the public as opposed to private interests can provide for the human majority better than private profit, then that's going to point us in the direction of eventually breaking the stranglehold of big business over the economy.
I know a lot of people, when they think about socialism, they worry about individualism. So what would you say to people about that, thinking that my individualism is going to be lost if I'm in a socialistic society?
Yeah, our goal is the opposite of what is often attributed to us. The slander against socialists as you want to bring us to totalitarian Russia. And in fact, that's not, as a democratic socialist, at all the type of society we aspire to, in which people are told what to think or told what to do. In fact, the reason we're socialists is precisely the opposite, is that we want to expand people's individual choices and their ability to have actual freedom as opposed to just paper freedom. Because in the United States right now, and like most capitalist countries, you have the right, in theory, to do a lot of things, but the material conditions and the economic burdens make it so a lot of these rights aren't practicable, right? So you have the right, for instance, to, in theory, you could go travel the world. You could do all sorts of things. You could become a capitalist yourself. You could become a billionaire. But if you look at the actual ability for most people to do that, the reality is when you're working 2 to 3 jobs, the jobs just aren't there and the opportunities aren't there to make it so that you have that time or you have that ability to rise up. So what we think that is by taking out this private ownership from a small minority of people, you'd actually be able to create the political and economic conditions through which people could actually have choices and have the material economic power through which they could leave a bad job and get a better job, or through which they could, together with a group of their friends and coworkers, found a cooperative that could actually function. You don't have that power for the vast majority of people in the United States right now.
Got it. All right, Eric, thank you so much for answering our questions. I'll see if we have any students. Oh, we do have some student questions, so go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Blount.
Marshall, and go ahead and stand right in here.
ma'am.
There
Thank
we
you.
go. Thank you.
My name is Marshall Wilson. I'm a student here at IWP, and I really appreciate you coming. So you're the author of Red State Revolt, is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, could you please just expound for me for a moment on the ideological roots of the recent spate of teacher strikes and perhaps the involvement of the National Socialist in that, or the Democratic Socialist, please? Thank you.
Well, the roots of the strikes are in
Go ahead and take the mic. Go ahead. Yeah.
the roots of the strikes are in decades of bipartisan attacks on public education. You've seen both the Republican and Democratic parties imposing privatization, making it really difficult for teachers even to do their job by imposing over-testing. And it's these basic conditions that have given rise to a tremendous amount of anger, because as a former teacher, and as anybody teacher can attest in the United States right now, it's very difficult to actually do your job of teaching students when you don't have the funds, when you have massive class sizes upwards of 40 people. So these are the conditions that led to the strikes. And as been in the case throughout U.S. history, radicals and socialists did play a role in the labor movement. By no means were they the only people involved, and that most teachers certainly weren't radicals or socialists. But I think that the case is clear that historically and in recent period, people understand that there is a conflict of interest between the small minority of business owners that control our society and the vast majority of working people. People understand that contradiction, tend to be really good union activists, and we have seen that recently as well.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we're going to have another guest with us. Go ahead.
Thank you, but I have to tell you, I feel at home. It's my map room.
Oh, it's your map room. We're actually in, because you are a teacher here. So we have Merrick. I hope I say your name properly. Go ahead and stand right
However,
here.
I'm not a Trotskyite with the teachers union.
Okay.
We don't have a teachers union.
No worries. Go ahead and step right here.
Right
There
here.
you go. Perfect. Thank
Okay.
you so much. Okay, and I'm going to say your name hopefully correct. Merrick Kodakovich.
Kodakevich.
Kodakevich.
Speak
Okay.
Spanish.
Thanks,
And
Spanish. All right. Thank you.
C silent next to an H.
Got it. Okay.
W is pronounced like a V. CZ is pronounced like CH.
Kodakevich. Kodakevich. Awesome. Great. I'm glad I got it.
Music.
Well, you are very passionate about this subject, and you are a teacher here at the Institute of World Politics. So remind us the importance of understanding history and the socialistic societies and the potential of totalitarianism.
I shall go Hollywood on you, if I may. Do you remember the cartoon Lion King?
Yes, I do.
Well, the lion cub told his tutor that the past didn't matter. So the tutor smacked him. And the lion cub was very baffled. So next time the lion cub said something special, and the tutor raised his hand, the lion cub recoiled because he knew what was coming. And the tutor, if I recall correctly, remarked, "Oh, you've learned from the past."
Wow. Very good. Thank you very much. Now, as I mentioned, you are a teacher here. Tell me some of the favorite subjects that you're teaching and the reaction of your students.
Well, I get paid for my hobby.
Got it.
And the students are divided into those who like to read and can be persuaded to read, and those who hate me because I make them read. I teach geography and strategy. I teach contemporary politics and diplomacy, post-Soviet politics and foreign policy in Russia, and mass murder prevention in failed and failing states. Plus, I also offer directed studies by invitation only. So, for example, you can learn comparative civilizations with me.
Okay.
Polyandry in Tibet,
Oh my goodness.
among comparative civilizations. I teach the history of conspiracy theory and practice for the paranoid. I teach Western civilization and its intellectual defenders, more or less from Edmund Burke. So I pick up after Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas, and St. Augustine.
Okay, when you're teaching your students, when do you see that aha moment when they start getting everything in your class?
I don't approach my students collectively. I can see which ones are superior, which ones get excited. So I scrutinize them and I perk up whenever I see that they can string the massive amount of facts that we try to impart to them together. They find analogies and they start understanding processes. We are a graduate school. Sometimes, naturally, we have a remedial situation because of the tragic condition of America's educational system, which includes having to have remedial classes in writing. But otherwise, any student who cares tends to do well. Those who are here to get their diploma only go through the motions. I pity. I'm always ready to help, but
Got
you can
it.
only help those who want to help themselves.
Got it. Now, do you think there can ever be a balance between capitalism and socialism, like your idealistic idea of America? You love America?
Okay, first, do I love America? Absolutely.
Good.
America saved my life, essentially. And therefore, I do not want to see any socialism here. What I want to see here is Christian charity and love towards those who are less fortunate. I would like to see the restoration of the old British attitude, my station and its duties. I would like to see people who are taught like I was at home, God blessed us more than others, therefore we have an obligation to help those who are not as fortunate as we are. And mind you, we lived in slums. The Nazis and communists had confiscated everything.
That was terrifying, I'm sure.
No, because a child doesn't know any better. So for me, it was actually funny. Everything is funny until this very day.
Well, thank you so very much. God, it's laughter. I understand. I think it's everyone's coping mechanism. Thank you so very much,
By the way,
Dr.
not everyone. First thing God does when He wants to punish you is rob you of your sense of humor.
Oh, goodness. Well, I think God.
Political correctness.
Oh, goodness. Got it. Well, thank you so very much. I appreciate that. And we'll be right. Oh, we have another guest. I'm not mean.
I'm the last one.
You're the last one, yes. Go ahead and stand right in here. There we go. I have Dr. Excuse me, Radosh, Dr. I want to say doctor, Mr. Ronald Radosh, Dr. Radosh, and you've experienced a lot in your life, and so tell me a little bit about your path to political philosophy.
Yes, I was a precocious young socialist and essentially young communist in high school because, as I said during the talk, I was propagandized in a private school in New York in the 1950s that all the teachers were communists, actual Communist Party members, and the history teacher in particular told us Marxism was a science and dialectical materialism explained everything, and therefore, he was an authority figure, a very good teacher, very commanding. I agreed with it. And the other person he converted, unfortunately, who still believes all this, was Angela Davis, the African-American former communist leader and extreme radical as she is today. So that's where I learned it. Fortunately, it lasted maybe through 2 semesters of college, and then I dropped it all. So it wasn't a long...
Well, talk about the moment when you dropped.
Yes, I started reading anti-communist literature.
Okay.
And official of the Communist Party came through, and he saw it in my living room. He saw the books. He said, "You're forbidden to read these." And I said, "Why? I can read anything I want." He said, "No, you can't." And he ripped out the international communist newspaper called For a Living Peace for a People's Democracy. He said, "This is what you should read." So I said, I'm through. That did it.
Got it. For free speech and individualism, I totally understand. So how do you think this debate went?
I thought it was a lot of fun. It went very well. I don't know what's small audience. I don't know what the people watching or will watch it, what they'll conclude, which side they'll come out with, and what they'll think. There's no way. I thought we were convincing, and particularly the last thing I threw out was after Bhaskar Sankara spoke, everything he said is vitiated by his endorsement in his book of Jeremy Corbyn as the future forward for a socialist movement in England, and it should be in the U.S. Now, Jeremy Corbyn is a lifelong Stalinist, a supporter of every anti-American movement and cause today, from Hezbollah to Hamas. Beforehand, the Soviet Union, he was at rank, if he wasn't a member of the party in Britain, he was a dues chiseler. His chief advisor now was a leader of the British Communist Party, and his whole record is anything but a democratic socialist, regardless of what he calls himself. My opposition supports him as the model. Well, that's not democratic socialism. If you're a democratic socialist, the last person you would support is a Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, talk about people who don't always have the time to read and to find out all the information that you do or someone else. Yeah. What would you encourage them to do?
Well, the thing is, if they don't, we have somebody wrote a book, a conservative wrote a book called The Stupidest Generation. I can't think of his name now. It's a good title because you have to read something. Now, the woman who's head of Democratic Socialism of America, I read a quote by a news report that she said, "I might be the only person in this organization," and bear in mind they have 55,000 now, so it's not totally accurate. She said, "who has read the writings of Michael Harrington, who founded the organization." Now that's something to say. When Sankara came out with his book, The Socialist Manifesto, I thought it would be a bestseller just because if even 3/4 of those members bought his book, obviously a bomb. Nobody in that organization reads, and the key example, of course, is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who constantly makes illiterate and stupid statements because she doesn't know anything. Yet she goes around Bernie Sanders as a, quote, democratic socialist. Well, somebody should tell her you're not an advertisement for democratic socialism, because as soon as you're a regular person, you hear her talk, you say, who believes this stuff? And she said she was campaigning for left-wing candidates. She won in a particular district of Queens and the Bronx. And that's a unique district, as every congressional district is. And the other Democrat running, who was in office for years, was actually a progressive, but he didn't campaign at all. He said, "I'm just shoo-in. I'm not going to bother campaigning." So he lost. They said he doesn't care about it. It's a local issue. But she went around with Bernie through the Midwest, where there were candidates like her running in primaries for the Democratic Party. And she said, when she went to Kansas, I watched the speech on C-SPAN, she said, my message in the Bronx is the same as my message here. People know it's true in the Bronx, and they know it's true in Kansas, and that's why whoever she was supporting will win. Of course, he came out last. He was totally crushed. Every candidate she endorsed lost their primary vote. That doesn't tell her anything. So...
And what do you think is the draw right now to socialism with the younger generation?
Ecology, because it is a serious issue, and of course their answer for it, which my opposition endorsed, the Green New Deal, is a very dangerous extremist proposal that won't work, that doesn't take complicated things into question. And, people who are young want total answers. If we do this, all the problems are solved.
Yes.
And they believe the Green New Deal is the only thing that sets the path forward. Well, they've lost the rest of the country. If they say that, they're young. Bernie's crowd, look at the crowds. They're all young. Maybe a few older socialists from the older generation, my age and younger, or even older. So these people, the young people, they're the base. They come out for the rallies, but there are not enough of them to let Bernie win something, win the primaries. I'm not even sure, even though everyone says Warren is a shoo-in now, I'm not even sure that she can win. She says, I'm a capitalist, I'm not a socialist. That's window dressing. She says the same thing as he does. She makes extreme, unworkable proposals. And I noticed when she recently went to the Midwest, she didn't mention Medicare for All, which she's endorsed. She didn't say a word about it because she knows if she said that, she'd be finished there. So she's smart. She knows when to say it, she's for it, when not to say it. No, she's not honest. I mean, if she got the candidacy, she'd be trounced when the election was held, and Republicans would make mincemeat out of her because they go through everything she supported and show her twists and turns. She'd be finished. Oh, goodness. So,
got it. Thank you so much, Dr. Radish. We really appreciate you talking to us and for taking time out for answering all the questions and things. Thank you so very much.
Okay.
All right. And I'm Carmen Tyler, and stay tuned. We'll be right back. And remember, around 12:30, we'll be talking to Michael Walsh, who is going to talk about his experience with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And we'll be right back a little bit later, and hopefully you'll stay tuned for that too.